His name passed through my hands 3 times a week. By then, it had already decided the fate of entire industries. I did not know him. I never saw him. To me, he existed only as a signature, neat, consistent, placed at the top of documents that arrived, one by one, on my desk. I processed them as instructed, noted the dates, entered the numbers, filed them away. It was precise work, predictable, almost small. But over time, a pattern began to form. The same names, the same addresses, the same decisions, repeating themselves across companies that were, on paper, entirely separate. And slowly, without anyone saying so, it became clear that what I was filing was not a collection of businesses. It was a system. There is a particular satisfaction in a well-ordered drawer. I discovered this earlier than I discovered almost anything else worth knowing. In the spring of 1882, when I was 24 years old and had been employed by the Standard Oil Company of Ohio for 11 months. My desk sat in the third row of a long room on the fourth floor of the Broadway offices, between a window that looked out onto the street below and a wall of oak filing cabinets that stretched nearly to the ceiling. I had a brass nameplate. I had a proper inkwell with a hinged lid. I had, on the corner of my desk, a small ceramic pot in which I kept spare pen nibs, and this pot had been given to me by my mother when I left Cleveland, and I kept it polished, and it was the one personal item I permitted myself in that room. The room was called, informally, the correspondence room, though its official designation, if it had one, I never learned. There were 14 of us at any given time, clerks, junior clerks, a senior man named Aldrich who sat at a desk near the door and distributed the daily work, and a boy named Patrick who came each morning to collect the outgoing correspondence and carry it down to the post room. We did not speak much. There was a kind of code among men in rooms like ours. Conversation was permitted during the brief intervals between tasks, the few minutes when one file was returned to its cabinet and another had not yet arrived. But to speak at length, to gossip, or to linger was considered a mark of insufficient dedication. We were, in the language of the office, men with tasks to complete. My task for the first 8 months was routine. I received documents, contracts, letters of agreement, certificates of incorporation, transfer notices, assignment of interests, sorted them according to a system Aldrich had devised, copied relevant entries into the master ledger, and filed the originals in the appropriate cabinet. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Each company with which Standard Oil maintained a relationship had a numbered folder. Each transaction with that company received a date notation in the margin of its folder. Once per week, on Friday afternoons, Aldrich reviewed the week's filings and initialed each ledger page. His initials served no purpose I could ever identify, other than to indicate that someone of greater authority than myself had confirmed the entries existed. I found this reassuring rather than dispiriting. The system acknowledged, through its own structure, that confirmation required a person, and that the person required a gesture, and that the gesture required ink. I was careful with my ink. I used a medium nib for the ledger entries, clear and consistent, and a fine nib for the notations in the folder margins, where space was sometimes limited. I kept both nibs clean with a small cloth that I replaced every second week. This is the kind of thing that seems trivial in retrospect and was, at the time, simply part of the work, the maintenance of the instruments of maintenance. What I did not know in those first months was how many folders there were. I knew my own section, companies beginning with letters A through H, approximately 40 folders housed in 6 cabinets. I knew, in a general way, that Aldrich managed the remaining sections himself or delegated them to the more senior men on the opposite side of the room. But I had not, in those early months, had occasion to consider what it meant that our room, one room, on one floor, of one building, required 14 men simply to process and organize the documentation flowing in and out of a single corporation. It was the kind of arithmetic that doesn't present itself when you're inside the thing. You see your desk and your cabinets and the stack in your tray, and this is the whole of your professional world. And it seems ordinary, because the stack is manageable, and the cabinets are finite, and the ledger grows at a predictable pace. It is only when you begin to ask how many other men are sitting at how many other desks, in how many other rooms, in how many other cities, each working through their own manageable stack. It is only then that the ordinariness of your desk becomes something else, becomes a data point in a very large calculation. This is the thing about working inside something very large. You cannot see its size. You can only see your portion of it, and your portion looks from the inside like any ordinary office. Documents arrive, you process them, they depart. This is the whole of your visible world. The size becomes apparent only later, and even then, only in fragments. I should tell you something about the city, because the city is part of the story, even if I did not understand that at the time. New York in the winter of 1882 was a city in the full tide of itself. I had come from Cleveland the previous spring, transferred, along with 2 other clerks, when Standard Oil consolidated several of its administrative operations from Ohio to New York. And I had arrived in April when the city was showing its best face. The trees on the side streets newly leafed, the vendors along Broadway selling oranges from wooden carts, the elevated railway on the 6th Avenue line running with a kind of rattling confidence that made the whole street vibrate pleasantly underfoot when it passed. It was, in those early weeks, a city that seemed to be in the process of becoming something. Not finished, not settled, but actively in the midst of its own transformation, tearing down and building up with an energy that felt, if you were 23 and newly arrived, almost personal. By winter, the city showed a different face. The elevated sprayed sparks down onto the street below when the temperatures dropped. The men who sold oysters from barrels near the ferry terminals wore their coats doubled and stamped their feet on the cobblestones with a rhythm that was half warmth-seeking and half stubbornness. The office boys who ran errands between buildings developed a particular hunched posture against the wind coming off the Hudson. Shoulders up, chin down, eyes fixed on the pavement just ahead, that made them look, from above, like small determined animals moving through a landscape designed without them in mind. I had taken note of the office boys early because they were the most visible members of the informal labor that kept the city's correspondence in motion. There were dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, moving through the streets between the banks and law firms and commercial offices, carrying documents in leather satchels or tucked under their arms, threading through the crowds on Broadway with a speed and confidence that suggested intimate knowledge of every building entrance and service stair on the island. Most of them were 12 or 13. Some were younger. They were paid by the message delivered or by the day, depending on the arrangement, and they existed in the cracks between the formal structures of commerce. Not quite employees of the firms whose messages they carried, not quite independent, simply present in the system in the way that certain things are present in systems because the system would cease to function without them, but has no official name for them. I thought about this sometimes, watching them from the 4th floor window. They were, in a very small way, doing what I did, carrying information from one place to another. The information was different, the distances were different, the compensation was different, but the function was the same. Something needed to be somewhere it was not, and they were the mechanism by which it arrived. I lived in a boarding house on 23rd Street, 8 blocks from the office. The house was run by a Mrs. Forsberg, a widow from somewhere in Connecticut, who served dinner at 6 o'clock sharp and expected her boarders to be present or to have notified her in advance. There were 7 of us, myself, a young man named Garrett who worked as a draftsman for an architectural firm uptown, 2 brothers named Culliver, Edward and James, who sold insurance and were forever arguing with each other in quiet, intense voices in the hallway outside their shared room, the arguments always about something specific and concrete, the price of a policy, or the correct procedure for filing a claim, never about anything that might explain why they argued so constantly. A schoolteacher named Miss Pruitt, who was the only woman among us, and whom Mrs. Forsberg treated with an elaborate respect that bordered on the ceremonial. And an older man, Mr. Sinclair, who said he was retired and who spent his days reading newspapers by the parlor window and occasionally making pronouncements about the state of commerce in America. Mrs. Forsberg's table was a reliable institution. The food was plain and consistent: roast on Sundays, a stew of some description on Wednesdays, fish on Fridays, eggs in various configurations on the remaining days, and Mrs. Forsberg herself sat at the head of the table with the quiet authority of a woman who has organized a household for many years and considers its organization a form of civic contribution. She asked questions of each boarder in turn, in the manner of a careful interviewer. What had happened today? What was the work like? Had we eaten properly at midday? She listened to the answers with genuine attention, which I came to understand was rare. It was Mr. Sinclair who first mentioned Rockefeller to me in a way that registered. Not mentioned. Everyone mentioned Rockefeller. His name was in the newspapers with some regularity in those years, attached to the usual range of epithets: the oil king, the richest man in America, the Napoleon of the petroleum trade. But it was Mr. Sinclair who first spoke about him in a particular way, one evening in January when the snow had kept most of us indoors and Mrs. Forsberg had made a heavy potato soup that made us all somewhat slow and contemplative. "The man controls," Mr. Sinclair said, gesturing with his spoon in a way that encompassed the whole room, or perhaps the whole city. "Something like 90% of the refined oil in this country." Garrett looked up from his bread. "Is that true? 90%? "The newspapers say so. The Hepburn Committee said so 3 years ago. I read the testimony when it came out. 90%. Mr. Sinclair put down his spoon. "Think about what that means. Every lamp in every house, every factory floor, every machine that requires lubrication in every city in the United States. The kerosene in your parlor lamp, the oil that keeps the looms running in the textile mills, the grease on the axles of every freight wagon in the country. He touches it. All of it." Miss Pruitt said she found it rather remarkable that one man could manage so much. "It isn't one man," Mr. Sinclair said. "That's precisely the point. One man is the center. One man makes the decisions, or approves the decisions, or sets the conditions within which the decisions are made. But the thing itself, the mechanism, is thousands of people. People who do not know each other. People who each do their portion, see their portion, are responsible for their portion, and nothing more." "Like a government," Garrett said. Mr. Sinclair considered this. "Like a government, yes. Except that a government answers, in theory, to the people it governs. This answers only to itself." He picked up his spoon again. "And it is more efficient than any government I have encountered." I finished my soup. I did not mention that I was one of the thousands. I should be precise about what I knew in those first months and what I did not. I knew that Standard Oil was very large. I knew that it was headquartered in Cleveland, where I had worked, though it maintained substantial operations in New York, where the financial arrangements were managed. I knew that it refined and sold petroleum products, kerosene being the most significant, but also lubricating oils, naphtha, paraffin, and that it did this on a scale that had no parallel in American commercial history. These things were common knowledge, available to anyone who read a newspaper. What I did not know, working in the correspondence room in those early months, was the mechanism. And by mechanism, I do not mean the physical operations, the refineries, the pipelines, the barrels and tanks and railroad cars that formed the material infrastructure of the business. I mean the legal and financial mechanism, the structure of arrangements through which one organization had come to control what Mr. Sinclair estimated at 90% of the oil refined in the United States. I learned this mechanism slowly, over years, the way one learns a language by immersion rather than study, not by being taught, but by encountering the same patterns in enough contexts that their meaning gradually clarifies. The first piece of the mechanism I understood was the simplest and the most visible in my daily work: the sheer number of entities. Standard Oil, or rather the collection of enterprises that operated under or in relation to Standard Oil, was not one corporation. It was many corporations. In my section alone, I had 43 folders. Each folder represented a distinct legal entity, its own name, its own state of incorporation, its own officers listed in its own certificate. From a purely clerical perspective, they were 43 separate things. But they arrived on my desk in the same way. They were filed in the same room, by the same clerks, according to the same system. Their documents traveled to us through the same channels, and the names that appeared in the certificates, the officers, the trustees, the designated agents, recurred across them in patterns that I had not yet learned to interpret, but which I could not help but notice, because noticing patterns in documents was, after all, the basic skill my work required. I had not yet formed any thought about what these patterns meant. I was, at this stage, simply noticing. The words circulated in the office in early 1882 with the peculiar quality of words that everyone uses and no one fully explains. The trust. I had heard it in legal contexts before. Trust accounts, trust arrangements, the sort of thing that arose in estates and inheritances. But this was different, and it took me some time to assemble a working understanding of it from the fragments available to a clerk of my position. What I eventually understood, pieced together from what I could read, from what I overheard in the brief corridors between tasks, and from what the documents themselves suggested, was this. In January of 1882, the Standard Oil Trust had been formally established. 42 companies, refineries, pipeline interests, and related enterprises scattered across Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and several other states had placed their shares into the hands of 9 trustees. The trustees, in turn, issued trust certificates to the shareholders of those companies. The certificates were interchangeable across all the constituent enterprises. The shareholders received their dividends from a combined pool. But the actual control of all 42 companies, the decisions about operations, about pricing, about expansion and contraction, about which refinery ran at capacity and which ran at half, resided entirely with the trustees. It was, I came to understand, a mechanism for doing in practice what law did not yet permit in theory. The laws of most states, in 1882, did not allow one corporation to own shares in another corporation operating in a different state. The trust arrangement stepped around this restriction with a precision that suggested considerable legal ingenuity. No corporation owned anything. The trustees, acting as individuals, held the shares. They acted in concert, as a committee. The certificates moved freely across state lines because they were certificates, not corporate shares. The result was a single, unified enterprise, what Mr. Sinclair called, with some reluctant admiration, a machine of remarkable elegance that presented, to the outside world, the appearance of 42 separate companies. This is what I was filing. Each of the 42 companies maintained its own documentation, its own incorporation papers, its own contract files, its own correspondence. Each arrived at our office through its appropriate channel and was processed according to its appropriate folder. A clerk working on folder A14, the Atlantic Refining Company of Philadelphia, had no particular reason, in the course of his ordinary work, to connect it to folder B-07 or folder C-22. The folders were separate. The cabinets were separate. The reference numbers were separate. The connection existed, but it existed at a level above the correspondence room. It existed in the trust agreement itself, a document I had never seen and was not likely to see, and in the minds of the 9 trustees. Not in my ledger. My ledger recorded what was. It did not record what related to what. Unless, of course, a clerk were to develop the habit of noticing names. I had developed this habit. Aldrich was a man of perhaps 50, with a manner so controlled that it communicated, paradoxically, a great deal. He had been with Standard Oil since the early 1870s. This I understood from a remark he made once in passing, a remark he seemed to immediately regret, as if any personal disclosure constituted a professional lapse. He dressed with a consistency that I came to recognize as a form of personal policy. Gray suit on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Dark blue suit on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Both suits were well maintained, brushed daily by the look of them. His shoes were always clean. His collar was always correct. He wore, in cold weather, a dark overcoat with a small velvet collar, and he carried it over his arm when he arrived, rather than wearing it into the office. A habit I noticed because I had not thought, before observing it, that one might make a deliberate decision about such a thing. He arrived exactly 8 minutes before the official start of the working day. I know this because I once arrived 9 minutes early, an unusual occurrence, and he was already at his desk, his coat on the hook, his materials arranged. He was scrupulously fair. This was the thing about Aldrich that most distinguished him from men who hold similar positions. He distributed the work without apparent favoritism, calibrating it to the demonstrated capacity of each clerk rather than to any consideration of preference or social arrangement. When a clerk made an error, he corrected it without comment or tone, simply indicated what was wrong, indicated what the correct approach was, and returned the document. He did not keep visible records of errors, and they did not appear to influence the distribution of subsequent work. He was precise about the filing system. He had designed it himself, as far as I understood, or at least had maintained and refined it over sufficient years that it had become inseparable from his presence. When I later came to understand the full scope of what the filing system was tracking, the number of entities, the complexity of their interrelationships, I developed a retrospective respect for the system's architecture that was separate from, and larger than, my respect for Aldrich himself. The system was an intellectual achievement. He never explained anything he was not directly asked to explain. And when he was asked, his explanations were accurate, complete, and minimal. I tested this, carefully, in April of 1882, approximately 6 weeks after I had received the new stack of folders. I went to his desk on a Thursday morning, during the brief window between the distribution of the daily work and the onset of the working quiet. I had manufactured a small clerical question. I had noticed a genuine anomaly in a reference number cross-reference, which gave me a legitimate entry point, though my actual purpose was somewhat broader. I noticed, I said, showing him the relevant ledger page, that this address appears in 2 separate folders, here in the Buckeye Pipeline entry, and here in what appears to be an Indiana Refiners Agreement. I wanted to confirm whether there should be a cross-reference notation I've been missing. Aldrich looked at the page. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quietness of a man thinking about an answer, but the quietness of a man considering something adjacent to the answer. The frame around the question, perhaps, or the implications of the question's existence. The cross-referencing between entities is handled at a level above this office, he said. Your responsibility is to maintain each folder according to its own reference system. The relationships between separate folders are not part of your task. He said this without any particular emphasis on not part of your task. He handed back the ledger page. I see, I said. Thank you. I returned to my desk. I opened the ledger. I continued entering the numbers. But I turned Aldrich's answer over in my mind for the rest of the afternoon, the way one turns a small stone over in the hand, feeling its edges. He had not said there were no relationships between folders. He had said the relationships were handled elsewhere, and that they were not my task. Both of these things were true, and also neither of them was an answer to what I had actually been asking, which was not a question about procedure, but a question about what was there. The relationships existed. They were, somewhere, understood and maintained, just not by me. I found this more interesting than a rebuke would have been. I should explain, before going further, the nature of my specific proximity to Rockefeller. I never met him. I never saw him. I never heard his voice. In all my years in the correspondence room, he remained to me what he was to most people: a name in newspapers, a presence inferred from documents, a signature. The signature is the important part. On certain categories of documents, the more significant agreements, the transfers of substantial interest, the letters that finalized arrangements rather than merely proposed them, there appeared, in the upper right corner of the first page, a line marked Approved or Authorized, and below this line, a signature. The signature was, in many of the most significant documents, John D. Rockefeller's. He signed with a particular economy, J. D. Rockefeller, in a hand that was neat without being ornate, efficient without being cold. The R in Rockefeller began cleanly and completed itself without flourish. The D in the middle initial was a single economical curve. The letters were clearly formed, consistently sized, written with the regularity of a man who has signed his name thousands of times and sees no reason to vary the performance. It was a signature that communicated, if a signature can communicate, a complete indifference to the impression it made. It existed to authorize, not to display. It was a functional thing, and it functioned. I processed perhaps 3 or 4 documents bearing this signature each week. In the early months, this seemed like a significant number. Later, when I had a better understanding of the total volume of documentation that the Standard Oil enterprise generated, 3 or 4 signatures per week in my section alone struck me as a modest figure. There must have been dozens of clerks processing his signature in rooms across the country. The signature was distributed across the system like a seed distributed across a field, each instance doing its specific work, no instance aware of the others. My processing of the signature was identical to my processing of any other mark on any other page. I noted the date, entered the reference number, filed the original. The signature did not change my procedure. It did not need to, but I noticed it. Of course I noticed it. My salary was $920 per year. My rent at Mrs. Forsberg's was $4.50 per week. A good dinner out at a chop house on Broadway might cost 40 cents. New boots, $2.75. These were the numbers in which I lived and thought about money. The numbers in the documents I processed existed in a different system of measurement entirely. Acquisition costs denominated in hundreds of thousands of dollars. Pipeline construction agreements in the millions. Transfers of interest at valuations that would have funded the entire operation of our correspondence room for decades. I processed these numbers as reference items, noted them in the margin, recorded them in the ledger, and then filed them, and the numbers disappeared into the cabinets along with everything else. The signature connected these two worlds. It sat at the top of the page, authorizing the large number. It traveled to my desk. I noted the reference. I filed the page. This happened, in my section, 2 or 3 times per week. I thought about it sometimes, walking home in the evenings. The city at the end of the day had a particular quality of exhausted motion. The buildings emptying, the elevated groaning under the weight of men standing close in their coats, the vendors packing their carts as the temperature fell. The signature had been somewhere else this morning. In an office in Cleveland, perhaps, or in a meeting room in Pittsburgh. Someone had laid a document on a table, and he had read it, or perhaps only reviewed its summary, and then he had uncapped his pen and signed his name, and the document had been folded and sealed and given to a messenger. It had traveled. It had arrived in our post room. Patrick had carried it upstairs. Aldrich had placed it in my tray. I had processed it. Between his desk and my desk, the whole apparatus of American commerce in motion. I began, sometime in the autumn of 1882, to keep a private record. This was not a decision, exactly. It was something I found myself doing before I had consciously chosen to do it. The choice arriving in retrospect as merely the recognition of a practice already established. I had, over the summer months, developed the habit of noting certain observations in the margins of my own working notes. Things that didn't fit neatly into the ledger categories, but that seemed worth preserving. In September, I transferred these margin notes into a proper notebook. I purchased it from a stationer's on 14th Street. Black cover, cream pages, a good binding that would hold up to regular use. I wrote in it at home, in the evenings, by the lamp on my writing table. I was careful about what I recorded. I did not copy documents. This would have been a serious breach of my employment, and I was, whatever else I might be, a careful man with regard to the limits of my position. What I recorded was not information in any proprietary sense, but rather pattern, the shape of what I was seeing, described without specific names or figures. A company that appeared in one folder as a contracting party and in another folder as a holding entity. An address that appeared in 3 separate incorporation documents for 3 separate companies, none of which shared officers. A set of names, 4 men, always the same 4, who appeared with remarkable consistency as officers or trustees across documents for companies incorporated in different states. The companies had different names. The states were different. The business described was different. The men were the same. None of this was secret. These were legal documents, properly filed with the relevant state authorities, publicly available to anyone who chose to look. The patterns I was observing were patterns that any sufficiently attentive person with access to the relevant filings might have observed. What I had was not special knowledge. I had proximity and repetition. The same documents crossing my desk in sufficient volume and regularity that the patterns became visible in a way they might not have been to an occasional observer. What emerged over the autumn months of 1882 was an incomplete but suggestive picture. There were, I came to understand, several functional categories of entity in the filing system, though they were not labeled as such, and the categories were my own construction. The first category was the operating companies, the actual refineries, the actual pipeline facilities, the actual commercial enterprises that did the physical work of the business. The Standard Oil Company of Ohio, the Atlantic Refining Company in Philadelphia, the Vacuum Oil Company in Rochester, the Camden Consolidated in New Jersey. These entities had employees and facilities and daily operations. They were, in the straightforward sense, companies. The second category was what I thought of privately as the holding structures, entities whose documentation consisted almost exclusively of ownership certificates and trust arrangements. These companies did not, as far as I could determine, do anything in the operational sense. They held interests in other companies. Their addresses were frequently the offices of attorneys. They existed, as far as I could tell from my position, purely as legal vessels for the containment of ownership. The third category was the companies in motion, entities that were clearly in the process of transition from one state to another. An independent refinery completing a negotiation with Standard Oil and transferring its operating interests. A pipeline company being folded into the National Transit Company structure. These transitional companies generated a particular burst of documentation. Transfer agreements, amendments to certificates, notifications to state authorities, and then either went quiet or disappeared from my section entirely, their files closed and archived somewhere below. It was the third category that occupied me most, not because it was the most common, but because it was the most legible account of what was actually happening in the system. The transition documents told a story. They had a before and an after. They contained, in their careful legal language, a record of an independence that had existed and had now been arranged otherwise. I was not an educated man in the formal sense. I had attended school in Cleveland through the age of 16, when my family's circumstances made continued schooling inadvisable, and had then gone to work for a dry goods merchant on Euclid Avenue as an errand boy and later as an assistant to the bookkeeper, a patient and meticulous man named Graves who had taught me the principles of double-entry accounting with a thoroughness that served me well when I later applied for the clerical position at Standard Oil. From Graves, I had learned not only the mechanics of the ledger, but the discipline of attention that ledger work requires, the understanding that a figure written carelessly is a figure that will cause trouble later, and that trouble later is always more expensive than care now. I had no training in law or economics or the theory of commercial organization. The word monopoly was used in the newspapers, but the arguments about what it meant were conducted in terms I followed only partially. What I had was the figures, and the patience to sit with them. And the figures, by the autumn of 1883, were saying something I did not have a word for, but could feel as a kind of structural understanding, the way you understand the shape of a room after you've walked its perimeter in the dark. The contracts in my files, the agreements by which Standard Oil's operating companies sold kerosene to distributors, or by which its pipeline companies charged for transport, did not negotiate in the way I would have expected contracts to negotiate. There was no back and forth visible in the documentation. There was no sequence of offers and counteroffers, no evidence of the adjustments and compromises that characterize a transaction between parties with genuinely competing interests. The prices appeared in the contracts as settled facts. They had been determined, somewhere, by someone, before the contract arrived at my desk. This was not, in itself, remarkable. Many commercial arrangements involve prices set in advance of the written contract through verbal negotiation or preliminary agreement. But the prices were consistent. Not identical, the contracts varied by distance, by volume, by the specific conditions of each arrangement, but they were consistent in a way that crossed geographic and organizational boundaries in a manner that independent negotiation would not produce. A distributor in Cincinnati and a distributor in Philadelphia and a distributor in Buffalo were paying prices that bore a relationship to each other that no three independent negotiations would arrive at by coincidence. I had a memory of something Mr. Sinclair had said at dinner many months before. 90%. If one entity controlled 90% of the refined oil in the country, then the question of what the distributor in Cincinnati paid for kerosene was not a negotiating question. It was a decision question. What should the price be? And the answer that the entity with 90% of the supply chose, was the price. Not because anyone was forced to accept it at gunpoint, but because the alternative to accepting it was going without kerosene, and the alternative to going without kerosene was going without light. I had not understood this in the abstract when Mr. Sinclair said it. I understood it now in a very specific way. I had seen the contracts, and the contracts were not negotiations. They were notifications. I closed my notebook and sat for a while in the quiet of my room, listening to Mrs. Forsberg's house settle around me. The familiar sounds of the pipes contracting in the cold, the Culliver brothers murmuring through the wall, someone going up the stairs to the third floor with a slow and heavy tread. I did not know what to do with what I understood. That question would remain with me for a long time. I should say something about Garrett, because Garrett was, during those years, something close to a friend, which was not a category I maintained with much ease or frequency. Garrett was 26 when I arrived at Mrs. Forsberg's, a draftsman at an architectural firm, a man of long silences and precise observations, which combination I found comfortable. He had grown up in Baltimore, the son of a carpenter, and had come to New York by way of a technical school in Philadelphia where he had studied structural drawing. He had a quality I found useful in a companion. He was interested in things without being troubled by them. He could hear about something that struck me as alarming and find it genuinely fascinating without becoming exercised. We fell into the habit of walking together on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted. In the spring of 1883, we had gotten into the habit of walking to the Brooklyn Bridge, which had been completed the previous May, and which remained, a year later, an object of considerable interest to anyone who paid attention to what had been built. For Garrett, it was professional. He had opinions about the cable system, the granite towers, the relationship between the visible structure and the forces it was managing. I found his opinions useful because they made the bridge legible in a way it had not been before. One Sunday in December of that year, cold and clear, the sky the particular blue that appears only in winter, I found myself saying something I had not planned to say. "I think I am beginning to understand," I said, "how the thing actually works, the company, the mechanism." Garrett looked at me. He knew I worked for Standard Oil in a clerical capacity. He knew nothing beyond this. "Tell me," he said. I thought about how to say it. The bridge traffic moved past us. Pedestrians, a cart horse pulling a wagon of barrels, a man on a bicycle proceeding through some private difficulty with the cobblestones. The cables above made their faint, low sound in the wind. "It presents as many companies," I said. 40, 50, more. I don't know the total. Each with its own name, its own incorporation, its own officers. Separate, legally. Distinct." I paused. "But the documentation travels to the same room. The same names appear in the officer lists. The same addresses appear in the filing details. And the decisions that produce the contracts, the prices, the transfers, the decisions come from one place. And that place is? The trustees, 9 men, who were, before they became trustees, the senior partners of the original Standard Oil Company of Ohio. They hold the shares of all the constituent companies. They act together. The form says 40 companies. The substance is one." Garrett was quiet for a moment. He had the useful habit of treating what was said to him as something that deserved actual consideration rather than immediate response. "Is that illegal?" he said at last. "I don't know enough law to say. I suspect the question is being considered. There were hearings 3 years ago about the railroad arrangements, the rebates, the preferential rates. Nothing came of them that I could see. The form of the railroad arrangements changed somewhat. The substance continued. And you see this in the documents." "I see the edges of it. The documents are the results of decisions, not the decisions themselves. I can see that an acquisition has occurred. I cannot see the conversation that preceded it. I can see that a transfer has been formalized. I cannot see what was said to the man who agreed to transfer." Garrett looked at the bridge's far tower, rising above the Brooklyn rooftops. "And the man who controls it all, Rockefeller, you deal with his documents?" "His signature passes through my hands several times a week." "But you've never seen him?" "Never." Garrett thought about this. "You're describing something very strange," he said finally. "A man who is everywhere in his effects and nowhere in his presence." I had not put it quite like this before, but it was accurate. "Yes," I said, "that is precisely what I am describing." We walked back in the cold, talking of other things. I did not raise the subject again with Garrett for several months, though I thought about what he had said, everywhere in his effects and nowhere in his presence, with some frequency in the evenings, sitting at my writing table with my notebook open, the lamp making its circle of warmth against the dark. The years have a way of becoming their details. 1884, for me, is the smell of the office in summer, paper and ink and the oil they used on the wooden floors, the combination intensified by the heat that accumulated on the 4th floor from June onward and did not fully dissipate until October. It is the sound of Patrick's shoes on the stairs each morning, 3 quick steps, and then the brief pause where the landing shifted, regular as a clock. It is the particular texture of the ledger page under my left hand as I steadied it to write. And it is the documents of 1884, which were different from the documents of 1882. Not different in type, they were still contracts, certificates, letters of agreement, transfer documents. Not different in the procedure required to process them. Different in their geography. In 1882, the entities in my section had been concentrated in the established oil territory: Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, the eastern states where the industry had its roots. By 1884, the geography of the documentation had expanded. Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, which had been peripheral and was now generating a regular flow of acquisition documents. New Jersey, now with additional holding companies incorporated under the relatively permissive provisions of the New Jersey laws. Kansas, Illinois. And the pipeline documentation had multiplied in a way that seemed, even to my cautious and deliberately limited analysis, significant. The pipeline system was, I had come to understand from the accumulation of documents, the key to the second phase of Standard Oil's dominance. The first phase had relied on the railroads, the secret rebates, the preferential rates, the drawbacks on competitors' shipments that had allowed Rockefeller's refineries to ship oil at a lower effective cost than any competitor, driving them either to merger or to failure. The Hepburn Committee investigation of 1879 had pulled some of this into the light. But the pipelines were better than railroads for this purpose. A pipeline, once built, was owned. The railroad charged freight to anyone with goods to ship. This relationship could be regulated, audited, the rates made public. A pipeline charged only what its owner chose to charge, to the customers its owner chose to serve. If the owner of the pipeline was also the dominant force in refining, then the question of whether an independent refiner could economically move his crude oil from wellhead to refinery was a question whose answer the pipeline owner controlled entirely. The Tidewater Pipe Company had tried to build an independent pipeline, and the documentation of its effort and eventual accommodation with Standard Oil had passed through my hands in 1883 and continued in 1884. I watched it, folder by folder, the way you watch a piece of news develop in the newspapers. Not all at once, but in installments, each installment adding something to the picture without completing it. The Tidewater effort ended. It did not end catastrophically. It ended in an arrangement, a defined territory, a negotiated settlement. But the arrangement, as rendered in the documents, was not an arrangement between equals. It was an arrangement in which one party had more options than the other, and the final terms reflected this. In the spring of 1885, I had my closest approach to Rockefeller himself. I mean this in the purely physical sense. I was present in the building on a day when he was also present in the building. I did not know this at the time. I learned it afterward from Patrick, who had seen the party arrive and had lingered in the lobby longer than he should have, with the instinct for significant moments that some young people possess and most lose as they age. He described it to me during the midday interval, with the barely contained excitement of someone in possession of news they cannot quite believe they have. Rockefeller had come with several other men. Patrick thought he recognized the general counsel and perhaps one of the trustees. They had gone directly to the elevator and up to the upper floors. What was he like? I asked, because Patrick clearly wanted to be asked. Tall, Patrick said. Quiet. He didn't look like what you'd expect. From the newspapers, he just looked like a man. A quiet man in an ordinary suit. I had heard this said about powerful men before, and had decided that it was probably mostly true and also somewhat chosen. That a man who had attained sufficient power had also attained sufficient self-possession not to require the visible markers of it. I had been on the 4th floor all morning. I had processed 6 documents and entered their reference numbers and returned 5 folders to their cabinets, and was in the process of reviewing a transfer agreement from a refining company in western Pennsylvania when Patrick came back from the lobby. I had not seen or heard anything. I thought about it afterward, that he had been in this building, possibly 40 feet above my head, at the moment I was entering the reference number of a document that his signature had authorized. That the document was, at that moment, in my hands. That the signature was there on the upper right corner of the first page, the neat economical letters, the specific formation of the R. We had been, briefly, in the same building. The mechanism had folded us into the same space, the man who decided and the man who filed the record of the decision. Neither of us was aware of the other. The distance between us was 40 feet of floor and ceiling and the entire structure of industrial capitalism. I returned the document to its folder. I returned the folder to its cabinet. I locked the cabinet and went back to my desk. The newspapers by the mid-1880s had begun to develop a more specific account. I had always read them, the Tribune and the Times, as daily practice, and when the budget allowed, the financial publications that ran longer analyses. In 1882 and 1883, the coverage of Standard Oil had been either broadly stated, large claims about the company's power, unspecific about mechanism, or backward-looking, focused on the railroad rebate arrangements that the Hepburn Committee had examined. By 1885, the coverage was sharper. Henry Demarest Lloyd had been publishing his analysis in the Atlantic Monthly since 1881, and his work had a cumulative quality that distinguished it from routine business reporting. Each piece building on the previous, each incorporating more specific information, each pressing further into the question of how, precisely, one organization had managed to establish the degree of control it had established. I read Lloyd's articles with a particular attention that I would not have been capable of in 1882. By 1885, I had sufficient context to read them as a partially overlapping account of what I had been observing from within. He knew about the railroad arrangements in some detail, more detail than I had expected anyone outside the enterprise to have assembled. He knew about the pattern of acquisition. He knew about the trust structure in general terms. He was right, in the large sense, about what the system accomplished. He was somewhat dramatizing in places about the intentions behind it, attributing to deliberate malice what might have been, in some instances, simply the application of competitive advantage with insufficient attention to its effects on the people disadvantaged by it. But what struck me most, reading him, was the gap between his account and my experience. He was describing the building, its architecture, its effects, its meaning. I was filing the bricks. His description was more coherent than my experience because he could stand outside the thing and see its shape. My experience was more granular than his description because I was inside it, and from inside it, there was no shape to see. Only the next document in the tray. There is a moment I return to when I try to describe what those years felt like, distilled into a single instance. It was an afternoon in October of 1887. The light in late October in New York has a particular quality. It comes in at a low angle from the southwest in the late afternoon, strikes the windows of the buildings across the street, and bounces back into the office with a kind of tired, golden quality. Not warm exactly, but the color of warmth, the color that warm light leaves behind after it has been through glass twice. It made the office look, in those late October afternoons, like a place that had once been something other than what it was. I was working through a set of transfer documents, a refinery in western Pennsylvania, a small operation, perhaps 40 employees, a production capacity in the lower range of what the major refineries managed, was transferring its operating interests to a holding entity whose address was a law office in Cleveland. The documents were clean and properly prepared. My work was the usual: enter the reference number, note the date, record the parties, file. I noted the parties. On one side, the refinery company. Incorporation date 1878. 9 years of operation, long enough to have built something, to have developed a customer base, to have made the investments in equipment and relationships that constitute a going concern. On the other side, one of the familiar trust structure entities, the kind with a law office address, and officers whose names appeared in half a dozen other folders in my section. Between these two parties, a transfer of interest representing, at the stated valuation, $47,000. I entered the reference number. I noted the date. I recorded the parties. And I thought, this refinery existed before Standard Oil needed it. Someone built it. Someone calculated the cost of the equipment and arranged the financing and hired the workers and signed the contracts with the crude producers and found the customers for the refined product. Someone drove out to the site when it was under construction and stood in the mud in the autumn and looked at what was being built and felt, perhaps, the specific satisfaction of a person watching their investment take physical shape. Someone's wife had asked, at dinner each evening, how things were going. Someone's children had known the smell of petroleum as one of the ordinary smells of home, the way other children know the smell of a bakery or a stable. The workers had known each other's names, had had their particular frictions and their particular solidarities, had known which of the boilers ran hot and which ran reliable. Now the refinery was a line in a transfer document. Now it was a reference number in my ledger. Now it was folder A47 in cabinet number 2, in a row of cabinets in a room on the 4th floor of a building on Broadway. The light from the windows across the street was very gold and very low. On Broadway below, a horse was being shod somewhere nearby. I could hear the ringing of the hammer, clean and repetitive, each strike slightly different from the last in the way that handwork is always slightly different. I filed the document. I closed the folder. I replaced it in cabinet number 2 and turned the small key and heard the lock engage. Outside, the light shifted as the sun moved further west. The room dimmed slightly. I returned to my desk and pulled the next document from the tray. In February of 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act became law. The news reached our office in the usual way, which is to say, it arrived through the general culture of the city before it arrived through any official channel. Mr. Sinclair had read it in 4 papers by the time I came down to breakfast and had formed firm opinions. Garrett mentioned it that evening with the measured interest he brought to most things. And Patrick, when he came through with the midday post on the day of the signing, left 3 copies of 3 different newspapers on the table near the door without being asked. The act addressed, among other things, the railroad practices that had been the subject of the Hepburn Committee hearings 8 years earlier, the secret rebates, the preferential rates, the arrangements by which a preferred shipper paid effectively less than the published rate, while competitors paid the full rate or worse. These practices were now prohibited. The railroads were required to publish their rates and to apply them uniformly to all shippers. The era of the secret rebate was formally closed. I read the relevant sections of the act when Aldrich passed a copy around the office that afternoon. I read it carefully. I returned it to Aldrich. I went back to my desk. The railroad rebates had been Standard Oil's original instrument, the mechanism by which, in the early 1870s, Rockefeller had secured from the Lake Shore Railroad and eventually from all the major railroads the preferential rates that allowed his refineries to operate at lower effective cost than any competitor, and which had enabled the rapid consolidation of the Cleveland refining industry that formed the foundation of everything that followed. The prohibition of the practice was, in a historical sense, a response to what had already been done. But the doing was done. The consolidation of the 1870s had happened. The trust structure of 1882 existed. The pipeline network, which I had been watching expand through 4 years of documentation, was in place. The pipeline was not a railroad. The pipeline was a different mechanism entirely, not subject to the Interstate Commerce Act as written, not required to publish its rates, not required to accept all shippers on equal terms. If the pipeline controlled the movement of crude oil from the wellhead to the refinery, then the question of what an independent refiner paid for transport was a question that the Interstate Commerce Act did not answer. I noted this in my private way, in my notebook that evening. The act was a response to an instrument that had already served its principal purpose. The organization had moved beyond that instrument before the response arrived. This was not necessarily intentional. I was careful in my analysis not to attribute to foresight what might have been simply the ordinary pace of organizational evolution. Systems develop along lines of least resistance. When one route is closed, the system finds another route, not because it planned to, but because it is the nature of systems to find available routes. The filing continued. The documents continued to arrive. The reference numbers continued to accumulate. By 1889, I had been in the correspondence room for 7 years. Aldrich retired in March of that year. His eyes had been giving him trouble for some months. I had noticed him leaning closer to the page than was his habit, squinting slightly at the smaller print. And he made the practical decision, with the characteristic lack of sentimentality I had come to expect from him, that the work required a standard of visual acuity he could no longer reliably maintain. He gave a month's notice, trained his replacement on the filing system with the thoroughness one would expect of a man whose entire professional identity was the filing system, and left on a Friday afternoon at the end of April with a handshake for each clerk and nothing more. The handshake he gave me was slightly longer than the others, or so it seemed to me. He may simply have been tired. I was recommended to replace him. The recommendation came from Aldrich himself, entirely reliable and possessed of a thorough familiarity with the system. I recognized this as high praise given the source. I moved to the desk near the door. I began to distribute the daily work. I began to initial the ledger pages on Friday afternoons, which felt, for the first several weeks, like wearing someone else's coat. I trained 3 new clerks from the Cleveland office, young men of 22 or 23, neat and careful, and entirely unaware of the proportions of what they had entered. I watched them process their first weeks of documents with the specific recognition of someone watching a pattern they have seen before. The attention to procedure, the gradual development of facility, the first small signs of the broader observation that comes with sufficient accumulation of the narrow task. I did not tell them what I knew. This was partly because it was not my place, and partly because I was uncertain what I knew in a form that could be transmitted. I had 7 years of accumulated observation. I had the notebooks at home, 5 of them now, filling a drawer in my writing table. What I knew could not be handed over. It could only be arrived at through the same accumulation they were now beginning. And there was a third reason, which I acknowledged to myself more slowly. I was no longer certain that telling them would serve any purpose I could identify. The mechanism operated. Their processing of the documents did not affect the mechanism's operation. My understanding of the mechanism had not affected its operation. The documents arrived, and we processed them, and they were filed, and the mechanism continued. And the question of whether the clerks in the correspondence room understood what they were filing was a question that the mechanism, as far as I could determine, did not need answered. This was a disquieting understanding. I sat with it, in my new chair at my new desk, and looked at the cabinets I had tended for 7 years, and thought about what it meant to be the keeper of a record that recorded things without changing them. In the spring of 1890, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled. The Standard Oil Trust, the court held, was in violation of Ohio corporate law. A corporation chartered under Ohio law could not, through its officers acting in a trust capacity, exercise control over corporations operating in other states. The trust arrangement, the 9 trustees, the trust certificates, the unified control over 42 constituent companies, was a legal structure that exceeded what Ohio law permitted. The trust was ordered to dissolve. I read this in the Tribune on a Tuesday morning before the office opened. I sat at my desk with the paper folded open and read the relevant sections twice. The legal reasoning was not difficult to follow. The court had found that the trust agreement effectively created a corporation-like entity operating across state lines without the authorization that would require. The form, trustees acting as individuals, did not save the substance, which was corporate control beyond the chartered scope. I folded the paper and placed it on the table near the door, where the other clerks would find it when they arrived. Then I waited, over the following weeks and months, for what would happen next. The documents told me. What happened next was this. The Standard Oil Company of New Jersey was reorganized as a holding company under the laws of New Jersey, which permitted corporations to hold shares in other corporations, including corporations in other states. The trust certificates were exchanged for shares in the New Jersey company. The constituent companies that had been held by the trust became subsidiaries or associates of the New Jersey entity. The 9 trustees became, in new roles, the officers and directors of the New Jersey Holding Company. The form changed. The substance continued. I processed the transfer documents over the summer and autumn of 1890 with the same care I had brought to every other document in 8 years. There were a great many of them, more documentation than at any time since the original trust formation, because the reorganization required the formalization of every arrangement that the trust had previously maintained through its own internal mechanisms. 8 years of consolidated control had to be re-expressed in a new legal form, and every expression required documentation. I needed 2 additional cabinets. I reorganized the room to accommodate them, moving the less active historical files to a storage room on the floor below and bringing in 2 new oak cabinets. This took a full day and left the room arranged differently than it had been for the 7 years I had worked in it. I stood in the rearranged room on the evening of the day we completed it, looking at the new configuration. The cabinets were orderly. The folders were in sequence. The reference numbers were current. Somewhere in the upper floors of this building, or in the Cleveland offices, or in the law offices on Lower Broadway where the Standard Oil attorneys worked, somewhere, a decision had been made that the Ohio court's ruling required a structural response, but not a substantive one. That the substance of the arrangement could be preserved if the legal form were changed from an Ohio trust to a New Jersey holding company. This decision had generated documentation. The documentation had come to my room. I had processed it and filed it. The system had found its next available route. I will tell you what I knew at the end of 1890, having spent 8 years in the correspondence room of the Standard Oil Company's Broadway offices. I knew the names of 123 entities that had, at some point during those years, generated documents processed through my section of the filing system. Of these, approximately 40 retained something that could be described as independent operation, their own officers making their own commercial decisions within their defined territories. The remaining 83 had been absorbed, transferred, restructured, or reorganized in ways that made the question of their independence a matter of legal form rather than commercial reality. I knew the shape of the pipeline network as it appeared in documentation, its eastern arc from the Pennsylvania oil fields to the New Jersey terminals at Bayonne, its western extension into Ohio and Indiana and the newer fields, its negotiated boundary with the tidewater interests. I knew this not from maps or engineering diagrams, but from transfer documents and operating agreements and the accumulated reference numbers in 8 years of ledgers, the shape of the system as expressed in the paper it generated. I knew the signature. I could have identified J.D. Rockefeller's signature from among 100 others, the particular formation of the letters, the absence of any gesture toward display, the consistency that comes from a man who has signed his name 10,000 times and has long since ceased to think about it. I had processed perhaps 1,500 documents bearing that signature over 8 years. I had touched each one of them, held the page, noted the date, entered the reference number, filed the original. I knew Aldrich's system better than Aldrich had known it by the end, because I had maintained it for an additional year after inheriting it, and had made the small adjustments that long use had suggested. I knew which cabinets ran slightly warm in summer, and which folders were therefore at greater risk of warping. I knew that the key to cabinet number 4 had a tendency to stick in wet weather, and required a particular angle of approach. I knew that the ledger pages from 1882 were beginning to yellow at the edges, and that in another decade they would require careful handling. These things I knew. What I did not know, whether Rockefeller, in the years I had processed his signature, had understood the full human texture of what the documents described. Whether he had thought about the $47,000 refinery in western Pennsylvania and the 40 workers whose employment it represented, the 9 years of investment it embodied, the family that had built it. Whether he thought about the distributor in Cincinnati who paid what the contract required because there was no alternative. I did not know this. The documents did not contain it. The documents contained terms and parties and dates and figures and signatures. Everything else was inference. And I had learned, in 8 years of managing documents, to be careful about inference. I will be honest about something because the story requires it. I did not tell anyone. I did not bring my notebooks to a newspaper. I did not write to Henry Demarest Lloyd, whose address was probably findable and who would certainly have been interested in the observations of a man who had spent 8 years inside the Standard Oil filing system. I did not write to the Ohio Attorney General who was, in 1890, pressing the case against the trust. I did not speak to a lawyer. I did not speak to a reformer. I have thought, over the years since, about why. The most honest answer is the simplest. I was not certain, at any point in those 8 years, that what I knew constituted evidence of anything illegal. I was a clerk with a notebook full of pattern observations drawn from documents that any attorney for either side of any proceeding could have examined directly. I had no documents. I had been careful not to take any documents home. I had observations and inferences and a structural understanding that I could not easily convey to someone without the context to receive it. And I had a salary of $920 a year and a room at Mrs. Forsberg's that cost $4.50 per week, and no savings to speak of, and no family who could support me if I found myself without employment, and a profession, filing clerk, that was entirely specific to large commercial organizations, of which Standard Oil was the largest and best paying in the country. These facts shaped my choices. I would be dishonest if I said otherwise. There is also this. I was not certain that what I understood was wrong. It was large. It was operated with a degree of control that left other parties with diminished options. It had accumulated its position through methods that were, at minimum, aggressive, and in some cases quite probably worse. But the kerosene it produced was real, and it kept the lamps burning in 10 million American homes, and the price of kerosene had, in the years I had been with the company, actually declined. Standard Oil's efficiency, its elimination of redundant capacity, had driven the cost down in a way that benefited the person who bought the kerosene, even if it disadvantaged the person who had competed to sell it. I did not know how to weigh these things against each other. I still do not know, with any confidence, how to weigh them. The mechanism produced certain outcomes and certain costs. Whether the outcomes justified the costs depended on questions of value that the documents could not answer, and that I was not equipped to answer with any authority. So I filed, and I initialed the ledger pages, and I walked home through the city, 8 blocks, thinking about nothing in particular. And the mechanism continued. I will end where I began, in the correspondence room, in the evening, with a well-ordered drawer. December of 1890, the office on Broadway. Past 8 o'clock, I had stayed late to complete a substantial transfer of documentation that had arrived from the Cleveland office that afternoon, a final batch of reorganization documents related to the New Jersey transition. I wanted to see it through before the week ended. The other clerks had gone home. The building was quiet in the particular way that large buildings are quiet when they empty. Not silent, but the sounds that remained were structural, the building itself rather than the people in it. A settling in the walls, the wind finding gaps around the window frames, the distant mechanical sound of the elevator somewhere below. The lamp on my desk, Aldrich's old lamp, which I had inherited with the desk and which burned more cleanly than my previous lamp had done, made its circle of light on the ledger page. The rest of the room was in the half-dark that the city's lights outside provided. Not quite darkness, but shapes visible without detail. The cabinets standing in their rows like the spines of books in a library, seen from the reading room at closing time. I finished the final entry of the week, blotted the page, read through the week's entries once, 27 documents processed, reference numbers entered, cross-references noted in the 3 cases where the documents involved entities that appeared in multiple sections. The entries were accurate. I was quite certain of this. I initialed the page, J.T. Hale, in the upper right margin, in the medium nib I used for the ledger. I replaced the ledger in its drawer. I locked the drawer. I replaced each document in its folder, each folder in its cabinet, working methodically from the most recently filed backward through the week's accumulation. I returned the cabinet's keys to the lockbox in the upper right drawer of my desk and locked the lockbox with its separate small key, and placed that key in my coat pocket where I kept it always. Then I remained at my desk for a moment, not quite ready to put on the coat. The room had a different quality in the near dark. The cabinets were solid and definite, their surfaces just visible. 9 of them now, 6 original, 1 added during the Ohio transition, 2 new ones from the New Jersey reorganization, still slightly lighter in color than the older 7, not yet seasoned by years of use. Eventually they would match. Eventually, if the filing continued, there would be more. I thought about what was in them. 123 folders in my section, each folder containing, on average, perhaps 35 documents. Call it 4,000 documents, approximately, in my 9 cabinets. Each document representing a decision, a transfer, an acquisition, an agreement, an authorization. Each decision having involved people, some of whom had made the decision and some of whom had been the subject of it, and these were not always distinguishable from the documents alone. 4,000 decisions, or their formal residue, compressed into 9 cabinets in a room on the 4th floor of a building on Broadway, maintained in order by a man whose salary was $920 a year. And this was one section, my section, letters A through H, approximately a third of the total. The other 2/3 were in other cabinets in this room, and possibly in rooms I had never entered. Beyond that were the offices of the attorneys, who maintained their own documentation. Beyond that, the records in Cleveland, in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in the offices of the operating companies scattered across 11 states. And beyond that, in a different sense, the physical evidence of the decisions, the pipelines in the ground, the refineries in operation, the barrels moving along the rail lines, the kerosene in the lamps. The paper was not the thing. The paper was the shadow of the thing, the record left behind by the thing as it moved through the world. But the shadow had a shape, and if you were patient enough to sit in the room where the shadow accumulated, you could learn something about the thing that cast it. This was what I had spent 8 years learning. I put on my coat. I buttoned it against the December cold I knew was waiting outside. I extinguished the lamp. The room in darkness was not quite dark. The city's light from the street below came through the windows in thin strips between the curtains, touching the cabinets with the faintest outline of light. They stood in their rows, locked, orderly, the week's work completed and contained. I stood in the near dark and looked at them for a moment. I did not know exactly what I was looking for. Recognition, perhaps. Confirmation of something I had understood for a long time and was simply, at this particular moment, choosing to acknowledge. Then I walked to the door, opened it, went out into the hallway and down the stairs, past the 2nd floor and the 1st, past the post room where Patrick would arrive at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and where the first documents of the next week were probably already waiting in their envelopes. Past the lobby where the night porter looked up from his newspaper and nodded without comment, and out through the door onto Broadway. The December cold came in immediately, as cold does when you step from a heated building into a winter night. Not gradually, but all at once, a fact rather than a sensation, the air sharp enough that the first breath carried a slight sting. Broadway at 8 in the evening was still moving. The city did not truly quiet until much later. The elevated on the 6th Avenue line was audible 2 blocks west. A cab moved past at a trot, the horse's breath visible in the cold. A man on the corner across the street was selling newspapers in a diminishing voice, the evening edition, getting the last of his sales before he folded up for the night. The lamps on the street made their intervals of yellow, with stretches of relative darkness between them, and I stepped through these intervals with the familiarity of a man who has walked the same route for 8 years. Behind me, in the building I had left, 9 years of documentation lay in 9 cabinets, 8 years of accumulation and 1 year of reorganization. The record of how 123 separate things had become, in every meaningful sense, one thing. The record was accurate. Whatever else might be said about those years, whatever the courts and the journalists and eventually the future would make of what Standard Oil had done and how it had done it, the record in my cabinets was accurate. The reference numbers were correct. The dates were right. The parties were correctly identified. The entries had been carefully made and carefully initialed and carefully preserved in properly locked cabinets in an orderly room on the 4th floor of a building on Broadway. This was my contribution to the history of the thing, a man at the edge of an enormous event, keeping very careful count. I turned my collar up against the December wind and walked the 8 blocks home.